All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Sydney. I'm a fourth-year PhD student here in the physics department. And today I'm going to be talking about LSST-Scale inference with strongly lensed quasars. So this is a new result as of yesterday from the TD Cosmo collaboration. And using strongly lensed quasars, this is a probe of cosmological expansion. And so for those that are not cosmologists, those three parameters I'm showing down there, those are some of our favorite ways. That's our favorite way right now to describe the expansion of the universe. And so this is the current state of the art with these 8 strongly lensed quasars. But with Rubin coming online, what I've been thinking about a lot is what could we do with a sample of 800 strongly lensed quasars? And if you look at the black contour on the left versus this gray contour on the right, which, huge caveat, is very much under construction, you can see that we get improved constraining power from this probe with all of these new lenses that we're going to discover with Rubin. And so the big challenge is making this analysis feasible. And so I'm first just going to introduce a very simple model for a strongly lensed quasar. So in the background, really far away from us, is a source galaxy, and that galaxy contains a quasar. And as the light from that quasar travels towards us, it gets bent by a massive galaxy along the line of sight. And so I'll call that the lens galaxy. And there's 2 main things that we observe. We observe the multiple images of the quasar in the back, and we observe different arrival times of light from that quasar to each of the images in the lens. And so these are our 2 main pieces of information we use. And what we use is a hierarchical inference to constrain the cosmology from those observables. And so what you'll see here is we have individual models for each lens. So in this very simple model, each lens has a mass, m lens, and light coming from the background source, L source. But what all of these lenses share is the same cosmology. All of these lenses live within the same universe. We'd like to exploit some other similarities. So we know that these lens masses all come from the same lens galaxy population. So in addition to inferring the cosmology that governs the lenses, we jointly infer a lens galaxy population that governs the individual masses of each lens. And then finally, in this model, I'm not inferring a population over the background source galaxies. But what I'm making very explicit here is that we assert some prior for what that source galaxy population is. And so it's important to keep track of that, and I think Laurence talked a lot about how these priors impact our inference. So in the remaining 2 minutes, I just want to talk about a framework that I was able to apply to some real data. So basically only using imaging data, so we're going to get rid of the time delay section. What can we infer just from imaging data? So from images of strongly lensed quasars, can we infer a lens galaxy population that governs those lenses? And so I'm highlighting down here within this inference, there's this likelihood term, and it's the relationship between the image of the lens and the individual lens parameters that make that image. And so this is actually, I would say, the most challenging part of this inference framework is this posterior estimation for the strong lensing parameters given an image of the lens. And so for this work, I used machine learning for this part of the inference. So we use a neural posterior estimation technique. So given an image of a strong lens, use a neural network to predict a posterior over the mass of that lens. And I'll note 2 things quickly. One is that you'll notice we're only asking for the mass of the lens. We're not asking for a posterior over the source of the lens, because for this science case, what we need is the mass only. And so in a way, this is an implicit marginalization over that set of latent parameters. So this is another example of why these neuroposterior estimation techniques are so powerful in astronomy. And the other thing I'll note is that the output explicitly depends on our choice of the training distribution. So now this hierarchical inference is modified with this accounting for the way in which we trained the network. And so this hierarchical inference is our version of accounting for distributional shift. So that was all to get to this final corner plot. And so what we're showing here is a hierarchical inference from these real lenses, these observed by Hubble over here. And what we're comparing is our machine learning modeling in purple and green versus hierarchical inference for more traditional models in pink. And so basically we see consistency here, which looking ahead gives us promise of applying these techniques to real samples from LSST and hopefully keep pushing on these challenges to make this possible. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sydney. What do you anticipate to be the biggest challenge when you apply this to Rubin data?
Yeah, I think in Rubin data specifically, like for example with the lens quasars, like the images of the lens quasars, there's multiple of them, but they start to get blended together. And so I think like things like that are gonna make this specific inference more challenging. But I also just think the high number. So when you're working with a larger and larger sample, you're gonna be more susceptible to any biases that are like lurking in your automated technique, yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Tiffany from Stanford ICME and SLAC. I'm presenting our collaboration work on graph-based surrogate modeling for particle accelerators. So over the next 5 minutes, I'll walk you through a little background on particle accelerator physics, our motivation for data-driven surrogates, how we use graph neural nets to model beam dynamics, and present some key experimental results. So, particle accelerators are machines that use electromagnetic fields to propel charged particles to very high speeds and energies that contribute to a wide range of applications from fundamental research in high-energy physics to medical applications such as cancer treatment and industry processes like material analysis. Accelerators rely on electromagnetic fields that satisfy Maxwell's equations. The motion of charged particles is governed by Lorentz force. And in practice, oscillating electric fields from RF cavities supply the energy gain, while magnetic elements manage particle trajectories, focusing and stability. Together, simulating and controlling a beam where every particle interacts electromagnetically with both the fields and other particles is inherently a very complex task. Historically, accurate modeling of beam dynamics relies on running self-consistent particle-in-cell or PIC simulations. These simulations solve Maxwell's equations on a grid while tracking each macroparticle's motion under the Lorentz force, accounting for collective space charge effects. Meanwhile, accelerator operators face dozens to hundreds of control knobs, including solenoids, field strengths, quadruple gradients, RF phases, and so on, and hundreds of thousands of diagnostic signals to monitor in real time. Therefore, running simulations for large-scale design exploration is computationally very intensive. Consequently, there is an opportunity for machine learning-based surrogates. By training a model to approximate these expensive solvers, we can achieve orders of magnitude speedup while retaining sufficient accuracy to enable rapid prediction and control. We consider graph neural networks as our candidate surrogate model because they can accommodate irregular domains with complex geometry and capture local neighborhood information in addition to global properties. Our simulation dataset consists of thousands of simulations where each simulation models a charged beam with a point cloud of charged macroparticles and tracks the propagation under EM fields specified by a distinct set of operational settings. The model takes an input point cloud, constructs a k-nearest neighbor graph from spatial coordinates of the macroparticles, then uses a graph network to learn the beam dynamics, and finally outputs a graph where the nodes contain the updated positions and momenta of the macroparticles. The graph network adopts an encode, process, decode structure. An additional challenge with this application is the beam dynamics vary significantly through acceleration because of the magnets installed at different locations along the accelerator. We have qualitatively different behaviors such as focusing, defocusing, rotation, or relative constant. Given the challenge, we decided to build a context-aware model that takes into consideration both the beam state and the EM field profile. We encode both the graph features and the context information into the latent graph, with the rest of the model unchanged. We can now use the graph network as an autoregressive surrogate and make predictions for multiple steps. So here's some preliminary experimental results comparing our context-aware graph network with a few baseline models, including the graph transformer, a point net adapted for regression task, and the vanilla graph convolution network. We see that our model outperforms significantly all the baseline models and captures a lot of the details in the beam distribution. So in conclusion, trained on particle in-cell simulations, the context-aware graph surrogate model can efficiently approximate accelerator behavior over a wide range of initial beam shapes and operational settings. And our ongoing work, including multi-scale modeling and investigation of optimal edge connectivity to capture both local and global physical interactions between the macroparticles. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks very much. It's often difficult to find the right linking length for the length of the edges or the complexity of the edges to have local and global features. What you could try, and you might have already, is to kind of use two GNNs, one that is very local and one that is sort of very coarse and global, and blend those together. That often works just very nicely.
Yeah,
maybe you have done that already.
Yeah, I am experimenting with architecture where there are multi-scale graphs constructed at different layers of the graph neural network. So message passing actually goes through different neighborhood sizes, different scales.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Is the goal to get this into a real-time control loop for an actual physical system? And if so, how do you think about the transfer learning from what you do kind of offline so that when you actually deploy it, it would wind up working?
Yeah, I think the eventual goal is to put this into, to generalize into a wide range of machine settings and different conditions. And that is partly why we insist on this context-aware model. We hope that the context vector could be more generalized compared to if it just takes in the nominal settings as given. So we could actually track the field profiles rather than tracking the nominal setting as float numbers. We hope with this setting, the model would be more generalizable.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Sophia, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Statistics. And today, I will be talking about likelihood-free adaptive Bayesian inference, but don't worry, there will be no formulas. Okay, so let me first briefly recap the Bayesian paradigm. So we have usually an expert or some kind of prior information aggregated over the literature or relevant experiments, and this constitutes our prior distribution. Then we have a grad student going out and collect some data. So this is our evidence. And together, we then update our prior belief with the newly collected evidence, which is called the data or observation, and we update to form our posterior distribution. Now, usually to obtain samples from the posterior distribution, we can make use of Markov chain Monte Carlo techniques, such as Metropolis Hastings and Hamiltonian Monte Carlo. But sometimes, the likelihood function is either analytically unavailable or computationally intractable, and we still want to obtain some sort of approximate posterior inference, even if this is the case. So this means this our previously Markov chain-based techniques are now not applicable. But the good news is we still have a family of inference algorithms that allows us to obtain approximate posterior samples. And today, I will be focusing on adaptive Bayesian inference, or ABI, which is our proposed method. So let me show you how ABI works. We start with a parameter draw from the prior distribution, and then we use our simulator to simulate some data under this parameter, and then we pass it to ABI. So then ABI compares whether these two data sets are similar enough. And you can see that these two galaxies are quite different. So we will go ahead and reject this parameter. Now, we can do this over and over again. Let me simulate another parameter from my prior distribution. I will simulate a data set under this parameter, and then pass it to ABI. ABI then compares these two data sets, and you can see that these two galaxies are actually looking much more similar than the previous one. So I will go ahead and accept this parameter. And we can put this parameter value that gave us a data set that we accepted into the approximate posterior set. So then you may ask, given all these data sets and parameter values, how does ABI actually makes these comparisons? What does it mean to be similar, and what does it mean to be different? Well, this is done through a process called nonparametric distribution matching. So assume here we have the observation, and then I generated some data sets using my simulator. What we first do is we want to estimate the posterior quantiles. So here, assume I am estimating these posterior quantiles at 5 different locations. And then I make the comparison, and I take their difference. So this is the difference. Well, I can refine my posterior estimates with some more quantiles. And so here, I compare the posterior distribution at these 10 different quantiles. And you can imagine this process going on, where I just do this over and over again, cutting at more and more finer places. And then eventually, I will get a very fine estimate of the difference between their posterior quantiles. So we call this the posterior MSW distance for the marginally augmented slice washer sign distance, which for time's sake, I will not go into detail. But here we have this distance for measuring how different and how close the two parameters are. Now, given this distance, we want to build the approximate posterior distribution. And we do so iteratively and sequentially, so we don't just do a one-pass rejection sampling, but rather we iteratively refine our estimates using the sequence of decreasing thresholds. So again, I will start with the acceptance threshold being infinity, which corresponds to directly sampling from the prior distribution. So here I am plotting the prior distribution. Now at time step 1, I set my threshold to be something, epsilon 1, that's smaller than infinity, and I will only accept all the parameter values who correspond to an estimated MSW distance between the target posterior and my current parameter that's less than or equal to epsilon 1. So this corresponds to a smaller region that's inside my first region, and we can update the partial posterior. So you can imagine this process going on, and I iteratively refine my partial posterior estimate, and also this corresponds to a smaller and smaller acceptance region in terms of my sample space, until we reach an epsilon tolerance that's small enough, which means my estimated posterior is within this tolerance threshold to the target posterior. So this is how ABI builds the approximate posterior using the distance, which is estimated nonparametrically, and then also the partial posterior is updated sequentially. So here I am showing the posterior estimated by ABI, and then also the Wasserstein generative adversarial network with gradient penalty. In black, I am outlining the true posterior distribution. And you can see that ABI resulted in an estimated posterior that aligns much better with the true posterior. And finally, this is what the sample trajectory looks like. You can see that we start with a very uninformative flat prior, but then just in iteration 1, ABI was able to already get the posterior shape correctly, and then in iteration 2, it further refines to match better with the posterior distribution. And this is joint work with my advisor, Professor Wing-Hong Wong, and if you're interested, you can scan this QR code to get the archive version of our paper. Thank you.
That's very interesting. So it seems a lot like ABC, but better. If you go to higher dimensions, how do you foresee it working, or are there failure modes out there to worry about?
Thank you for the question. So when you mean higher dimensions, I presume that it's higher dimensions of the data? The parameter space. So for parameter space, that's more difficult. For all of the likelihood-free methods, it's equally difficult because you still have the problem of exponentially scaling volume. Usually in the typical Bayesian setting, we assume that the parameter space is lower dimensional compared to the observation space. So otherwise, we might run into problems of unidentifiability and et cetera. And to your point that this is very similar to ABC, yes, this is connected. This is connected to ABC. We do take the acceptance-rejection-based approach to doing posterior refinement, but we do it sequentially, whereas the naive rejection ABC does it in one pass. Thank you.
Great. Let's give Tiffany
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Guillem Megias. I'm a graduating PhD student here at KaiPak. Nope, not yet. At KaiPak at Stanford, and I mostly work on the co-leading the commissioning and development of the active optics of the Rubin Observatory. And it will not surprise you that one of my main interests, therefore, is really understanding and optimizing the optical performance of the telescope itself, right? And throughout today, there's been a lot of presentations, and we've learned a lot about how, with the amount of data that Rubin will produce, the science that we will do will no longer be limited by the data access, but rather by our ability to really understand and optimize the telescope performance, right? And that's also very related to the last point that Josh brought up in his meeting, which is for the science we want to do, the data needs to be as good as possible, right? And what's behind the data that we take? Well, we have a really complex system. There's a lot of different subsystems and different components that make up the Rubin Observatory, right? It's a 3-mirror telescope. We can control the surface of the primary tertiary mirror and the secondary mirror. We can also control the position of the different optical components. And we also have leverage over different thermal elements of the thermal control system, right? And on top of that, we have a broad array of different telemetry data coming from thermal sensors across the entire dome and telescope mount assembly. And that's really important because a lot of the contributions that degrade the image quality in the telescope come from thermal gradients across the light path, and that creates turbulence, and that degrades the image quality, right? So we really need to understand that perfectly. And we need to understand all these different broad array of telemetry data and housekeeping data that we have, and see what are the correlations and the subtle entanglements between that and what we're delivering, right? And just to give you a sense of the scale, I made some really quick calculations of how much data there is, right? In the Rubin Observatory, the majority of the data is stored mostly in 2 different databases. One of them is the Engineering Facility Database, the EFD, and EFD stores about 40,000 fields. Some of them have different timescales. Some of them are related or not completely independent from one another. But that's a ton of fields. And then on top of that, we have the consolidated database. And that's a per exposure database, which intersection is not null with the EFD, but it's also not a subset of that. There's a lot of data products from actual on-sky images that go into the consolidated database, and that stores information about how good is our image, specifically what's the ellipticity, and a bunch of other metrics that we really care when we look at making some of these studies that people have been talking about today, right? So overall, that's about roughly 50 to 100,000 parameters per visit and per CCD, and so per visit per CCD, and over the span of 1 year, we'll take 2.5 million images, right? So that easily goes up to 10 to the 10 rows of data, and you can already see that there's a lot of, there probably are a lot of correlations there that are difficult to pick up, that are really convolved with one another, and we really need to understand that. Now, I don't intend to show you now the solution to that problem because we're just at the beginning of commissioning and we're trying to understand these dependencies, but it's more of a motivation of the problem that we have at hand, which is, in a sense, I think, somewhat new, because previous telescopes, while they did have a lot of telemetry, at the time they started, they may not have had also the tools that we have currently to deal with all that. And specifically with performing a survey that will last for 10 years, we also need to think about how are we going to optimize and really understand our performance throughout these 10 years, right? And so here, I guess the first step, and that's the only plot I will really show, is where do we start with? Well, I think the point where we start at is just looking for those correlations that are expected or that are physically informed, right? So the most evident one, and here I'm showing you some results, is what are the correlations of certain axisymmetrical aberrations on the two mirrors with the temperature difference on the two mirrors, right? So here on the left, you can see the correlations of two Zernickes, and we use Zernicke polynomials to express some of these optical aberrations. And so I'm showing what the Zernicke 11 and 22, which again are axisymmetrical aberrations, how those depend on the temperature difference top to bottom on the secondary mirror. And on the right, you see the same for the temperature difference top to bottom on the primary tertiary mirror. And essentially, as we commission the system, we've observed this, and that is also informing our tuning of the system, of the thermal control system, right? And just like we have this, there's going to be a bunch of more other metrics that we really need to get to the bottom to and optimize. And so here's, for instance, on the right, I show a plot of the current atmosphere. It's from all the images that have been taken so far, also from the beginning with the Rubin Observatory, it's the comparison between the atmospheric seeing and the delivered seeing. And this telescope needs to deliver what we call seeing limited imaging, right? So essentially, the atmosphere needs to be the limiting factor and not the telescope contribution. And you can see that there's a bunch of them that are actually on the line, which is y = x, which would be as being seeing limited, but there's a bunch of those images that are not. That's not necessarily too surprising also, because this also includes the images we've taken throughout the last month, which has been a lot of engineering, so we've been messing around with the system. But it's just to point out that, you know, a lot of the work as the next month and also the next few years will be understanding those points that are out there and whether there's any systematic correlations that can be disentangled. And I think that's it's actually a great problem for machine learning tools, where I think a lot of collaboration is going to rise. And I actually think that will really make Rubin not just a great survey machine, but also a well understood and optimized one. And that's about it. So thank you for your attention, and happy to chat.
I'm sure there's a simple answer, but how can the delivered seeing be better than the atmospheric seeing?
Great question. Yeah. Well, I guess the different reasons. Some of it is also the atmospheric seeing sensors that we're using. They're not necessarily well calibrated all the time, and they're not necessarily at the same position where the telescope is all the time. So that explains part of it. Essentially, that explains all of it.
Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Shuo Xin from Physics Department at SLAC. I will talk about the recent work on accelerating the 3D Gaussian splatting with the idea of adaptive mesh refinement. This will work with in collaboration with people in the East Coast. So I will first introduce what is 3D Gaussian splatting, and then introduce adaptive mesh refinement and evaluate our approach. So 3D Gaussian splatting is an idea raised in SIGGRAPH 2023 for faster reconstruction of 3D objects. The idea is pretty concise. We still use the traditional point cloud. We still use the traditional point cloud representation. But in addition, each point cloud is now smeared by a Gaussian distribution. At render time, we project all these Gaussians and the point cloud to the camera space and rasterize and blend in order. So it turns out that this simple idea is a pretty successful representation of 3D objects and data. So recently, there are also proposals to use this representation for a dark matter density map from the weak lensing data. So adaptive mesh refinement is pretty widely used in simulations. So the idea is solve the problem, usually a differential equation, at multiple levels of resolutions, whether it's a hammer or binary neutron star or a viscous fluid. So the key is to keep a hierarchy of grids at different levels of resolutions. And so each children node is kind of inherited from the data from the parent nodes with lower resolutions. So here we implemented a kind of a new CUDA kernel that allows for such refinement in 3D Gaussian splatting. So as an example, we can group the pixels. We can group the pixels 2 by 2. And at the lowest resolution, we only render those pixels like marked by 1. And only interpolate the rest. When the resolution increases, we do not need to do all the buffers and lower resolution calculations. We only need to compute more and more pixels as different offsets. So it turns out that this simple offset strategy is naturally compatible with the so-called SIMD, or single instruction multiple data of the GPU architecture. So we evaluate the quality of the images we generated by a user study. So we recruited some volunteers who were a Quest Pro and was asked to tell the difference between the full resolution image and the image rendered by our approach. So the result turns out to be approximately 50-50. So meaning that the user experience is not significantly influenced. So this approach, the ultimate goal is to aim at speeding up the frame rate or reduce the rendering latency. So we tested across different 3D scenes, different resolutions, and also different computing power, in the sense that whether it's desktop GPU with a higher clock frequency and compute units, and also mobile devices with lower computing resources. So in conclusion, we applied the adaptive mesh refinement approach to accelerate the rendering of 3D Gaussian splatting to allow for incremental and multi-resolution calculation. And this turns out to be faster than the traditional approaches. If you are interested, the QR code is the link to the final proof version of our paper. So thanks for listening. This is our